So anyway, so I'm going to be talking about social network analysis. Let me see if that works. That works. I'll be occasionally pointing back this way because we had issues plugging my, getting my Mac to work. So this is what I'm going to cover. I'm going to do a brief introduction. Before I really get started, I'm going to tell you a disruption story, true story about it. Most of the stuff I work with is with, you know, when we talk about dark networks, illicit networks, we're talking about, at the MPS, we're usually thinking about terrorist groups and that sort of thing. And so I'm going to be talking about disruption, and there's some strategies that are available in war zones that aren't in criminal situations. So keep that in mind as I'm going through. So give you a brief introduction, then I'm going to sort of go over what social network analysis is. I know some of you probably know what it is, some of you don't, so I'm not going to assume anybody knows anything. And then I'm going to talk about some strategies you can use for how you can use social network analysis to craft strategies for disrupting illicit networks. And then I'll do a quick wrap up, and we'll see how it goes. All right, look at that. I don't even have to turn around. All right, so these are some of the books that I have written, right? The far one, let's see, I guess, yeah, it's still on your right, is actually in Spanish. I can't take too much credit for that. I wrote a little introduction and they took some of my labs, but one of our former employees translated everything into Spanish, and so we actually have a Spanish introduction to dark networks. So when I use the term dark networks, it's very similar to when we talk about illicit networks. It's basically any network that's trying to stay hidden from authorities. Robin Milward defined it as covert and illegal networks. I like to think of it less as an either or and more of a continuum, right? And so here's a little graph from one of our books. As if you can imagine a continuum run from legal to illegal on one side and overt to covert on another. Down there in the lower left is sort of like your true, complete dark network. Up on the other right, you got your light networks, and then you have a lot of gray in between. I think most of your groups are going to actually fall more in between. So it's more of degrees, right, than either or. So most of the time, right, when we think about dark networks, at least when I talk about dark networks, I think about them as being bad, but you know, like terrorist groups and that sort of thing. But you know, they can be good or bad, right? Like I said, it's, you know, groups that are trying to stay hidden from authorities. And so what is good in one person's eyes may be bad in the other. So like this group here, Jakota, it was a resistance group operating in Warsaw, Poland during World War II. From the perspective of the Nazis, it would have been considered a dark network, right? But on this side of history, yeah, we think this is kind of a good dark network. And they were actually very, very successful in providing resistance to the Nazis in Warsaw, Poland. They, you know, they did publications, they carried out sabotage, they snuck food into the Warsaw ghetto, and they smuggled young children and babies out of the ghetto and placed them within convents. And in fact, I read somewhere that they smuggled like 2,000 kids out of the Warsaw ghetto, placed them in convents where the sisters then taught them the rosary and other Catholic liturgies. And so when the Nazis came along and would try to quiz them, right, they could actually respond. And I believe they had a 100% survival rate of the kids they smuggled out of the ghetto. So it's a pretty good story. But yeah, so Jakota, here is some of the organizations, resistance organizations that were running in Warsaw, Poland before Jakota was formed. And you can see some of them are connected together. This is organizations, not people. But it was kind of still disparate, right? After Jakota came along, there we go, it sort of brought all these organizations together. So it was like, sort of like a network of networks, okay? But a very successful dark network, right? Other examples of dark networks, right? We got Watergate, right? So there's the Watergate conspiracy, and over there on the right is Richard Nixon. I haven't studied this this dark network very much, but there was a couple guys who looked at these data. In fact, they're the ones who gathered this data. They found that people in this conspiracy group, those that scored high in terms of what we sometimes refer to as brokerage, people who are in positions of brokerage, right? They were most likely to go to jail because they were most likely to be testified against when the conspiracy was uncovered and people went to jail and were tried. Jewish underground. Here's a dark network. These guys are trying to blow up the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. It's still there, so they didn't succeed, obviously. But they did bomb some cars that were carrying leaders, Arab leaders, mayors. And the idea wasn't to kill them. They were just trying to maim them. What they were hoping to do is that they would have to live with their injuries so everybody would see them. And then they shot some students at one of the universities, some Arab students at one of the universities. And then they were actually busted when they were trying to place bombs on some buses that was taking workers either back, I can't remember if they were going back to the West Bank or the Gaza Strip. But the Israeli Secret Service got wind of it because of, it's a long story, I don't have time to go into it, but they were able to get wind of it, and they actually saw them putting the bombs on the bus, and so then after they did that, then they were arrested them, rolled up the entire group. 9/11 bombers, most people are familiar with that. Here's some drug cartels out of Mexico. This is actually from a thesis that some of our students wrote. Were you around? Yeah. So some drug cartels out of Mexico. Here's a wannabe ISIS cell out of Minnesota. These guys wanted to travel to Syria and join ISIS. Right? So all examples of dark networks. I did give you an example of one good dark network. All right, like I said, before I got started, I was going to tell you a disruption story, and this is a true story. One of our first students ever to come to MPS and take the Disrupting Dark Networks class. It was actually before I was there. I came the year after. I think he was in his last quarter, and he signed up for the class just sort of on a whim. And he got deployed after he graduated to northern Iraq. And they were trying to disrupt this insurgency. And he was looking at the data, and he said, I can analyze this as a social network. Right? And so he did. And he identified like some key individuals within the network. These aren't his data. After he did this, he wrote this really nice paper. I had him speak in my classroom, and he sort of shipped the paper and the data all over Europe. And then, like after about 9 months, the Army decided it should be classified. So I don't know how much good it did after setting it all out. So I don't have the data. So when I present, I use my own data. But I can still tell the story. Right? He is trying to get it declassified. I mean, the group no longer exists, and the war's over. But anyway, so he gave this information to his commanding officer, and they ran a kinetic operation, a coercive operation, a capture-kill operation on those key individuals within the network. Removed them from the network and had absolutely no effect on the network. The insurgency just kept rolling, just like the Ever-Ready Bunny or something like that, right? So afterwards, he updated his data and again gave the results to his commanding officer. But this time, rather than running a coercive operation, a kinetic operation, they ran a misinformation campaign, right? So they found some people, they identified some people in surrounding villages that knew people within this network, within this insurgency, and they fed misinformation into them by dropping thumb drives or notebooks and that sort of thing. And the idea was for this information to find its way back into the network, and then these people would start fighting with one another. Right? And that's what it did, right? This information came in, all of a sudden people started distrusting one another. And so in effect, rather than going after the nodes, they were going after the ties between them, right? Trying to sever the ties between them. And this insurgency just collapsed within a couple of months. And our former student, Dave Acosta, became the SNA expert of northern Iraq for the rest of his time there. All right. A couple of takeaways from that story is one, coercive strategies are not always the best, right? Not always ideal. And there's more than one strategy for disrupting dark networks. And social network analysis provided invaluable information when it came to actually disrupting this network. All right, so social network analysis, what is it, right? Genesis. Now, I'm not talking about the first book of Moses. I am talking about the beginnings of social network analysis, right? And it sort of has a complicated history, but one of the progenitors of it was a guy named Jacob Moreno, right? And he was writing in the early 20th century, right? And there's a picture of Jacob. And I just love this picture of him. It's the only one I've really been able to find. But he must have told a really good joke. I've never gotten anybody to laugh this hard. But look at the woman sort of down below. She's like trying barely to contain herself. But then the woman in the back she's just letting it all hang out. So I'd love to know what kind of joke he told there. But anyway, Jacob Moreno was one of the first persons to use social network analysis. He didn't call it that back then. And here's an article of his from 1938. And there's a graph, social network analysis graph from 1938. Notice he calls it a sociogram. You can tell that he drew it by hand. And in fact, if you look at the article itself, the mathematical equations that are in the article are actually written by hand too, right? So look at this. Notice that there's not a whole lot of clustering going on, but here's using a drawing algorithm to draw that same network. So now notice that there's a lot of clustering going on there that you don't see there, right? That's one of the reasons why we use these clustering algorithms, because when we're drawing by hand, it's easy to let our own biases seep into the drawings themselves, right? And then I'll show you one at the end when it's basically impossible to draw by yourself. Also, the names are kind of small, but there are like two people up there. I think in the lower right, I think there's Irene, and sort of in the middle left is a woman named Cora. And you can see Irene's kind of separated, and Cora's off to the left, but she's still kind of in that group. But if you look at this, you can see Cora is completely isolated, right? And Irene is down, she's in there. She's on the edge, but not quite as separated as the other graph suggests. Another example why we use these algorithms, right? Because if you just looked at his graph, you wouldn't think Cora was as isolated as she is. All right. So in between, the next guy who really took it off was this guy named Harrison White, but there's a lot that happened in between Jacob Moreno and Harrison White. There's a picture of Harrison White. He got his first PhD. Yes, there are people who do that. He got his first PhD in theoretical physics. And after a few years, he got bored and decided sociology was more interesting. So then he went and got his PhD in sociology, taught at Harvard for a number of years, then he went to Columbia. He unfortunately writes like a physicist. And this is his best-known book. He's got a lot of articles. His best-known book, Identity Control. It's got incorrect verb tenses. I mean, it is so hard to read. I finished it and I'm going, I'm not sure if I understood a word that I just got through. Even the second edition's better. You got a lot of co-authors for individual chapters, which made it a little bit better. But still, he's brilliant though. His students have been just like off the charts, and they can write better than him. So a lot of his ideas have actually filtered out. But yeah, he's just brilliant guy. And he was at Harvard in the 60s, and he helped turn social network analysis into a scientific discipline. Of course, back when he was working, back then they didn't have the computer power that we did now, so still we had to use with a lot of small graphs, small networks back then. Now we can use these huge networks that he couldn't deal with back then. But like I said, it's been around for a while. A lot of misconceptions about social network analysis. Probably the most famous one is, or most common one is, a lot of people when I tell them that I do social network analysis, they think I have something to do with social media, or specifically Facebook. I was down in San Diego. It's been several years now, but I was doing a one-day lecture down there, and I was flying back to the Bay Area, and The woman sitting next to me asked me what I did. I told her I do this thing called social network analysis. I spent the entire plane flight trying to convince her I did not work for Facebook, right? It doesn't help that the movie about Facebook is called The Social Network, right? But Facebook is social networking. It's not social network analysis. Same thing with Twitter, right? That doesn't mean we can't use social network analysis to analyze social media, right? So like here's some Twitter data. This is actually when Russia invaded Ukraine back in 2014, 2015. This is just a month or two afterwards, and we had one of our former students who was working with NATO, and they wanted to monitor some key Twitter accounts within the debate. I'll show you some slides of it later, some of the results. But we took some keywords and pulled some Twitter data, and this is what it looks like, right? You can do some more things with it. So you can use social network analysis to analyze social media, but it's not the same thing, okay? Another thing is that when people talk about networks, they're often, when they talk about the networked organization, right? As opposed to hierarchies, right? Decentralized organizations versus centralized organizations. And there's not a right way or wrong way to use the term network, but within the social network analysis world, everything is a network, right? That's why we have measures of centralization, right? We have centralized networks, right? So we use the term in a very specific way. And I tell my students that when you're presenting, you have to make clear, because a lot of times when people hear the word network, they're thinking these really flat, decentralized organizations. Finally, it's not the same thing as link analysis. Some of you may be familiar with some of the link analysis tools like Analyst Notebook and Palantir. These are not the same thing. They're a form of relational analysis, like social network analysis is a type of relational analysis, but it's not the same thing, right? So to sort of illustrate, here's a link analysis graph, and you can see that if you look at the A and B, assume there are two people, and A's got a tie to B, and it's got a tie to a car and a house and a bomb and a telephone, right? He's got 5 ties. B's got the same number of ties, but all of his ties are to other people except the phone, right? So you could say they have the same number of ties, or what in social network analysis we call degree centrality. But because they're tied to different objects, you can't compare them. It doesn't make any sense, right? We try to, within social network analysis, the algorithms are designed to compare like to like, right? So here's an example where A and B have the same number of ties, but they're all the same people or to the same type of object, right? And so that could, like people over here, it could be ties to different schools, but this makes it comparable, right? One's not necessarily better than the other, but the social network analysis algorithms are designed for data like this, right? Or data like this. So, what is social network analysis? So it's not a single theory, it's not a single method, it's really a collection of theories and methods, which assumes that people's behavior, and it doesn't have to be just people, right? I'll talk about that too. We can look at social networks at a number of different levels, but assumes that the behavior of actors is affected by their ties to other people and the networks in which they're embedded, right? So what do I mean by that? I'll use this graph. It's not my graph. It's from this TED Talk by Nicholas Christakis, which is a really good introduction to social network analysis. Like a TED Talk, 17 minutes, 18 minutes. It's really, really well done. He's a doctor, and he's done some interesting things with that. But with this graph that he uses, you can illustrate a few things with it. And what I want to illustrate is I want you to look at nodes C and D, right? Both C and D have the same number of ties. I think they each have 6 ties. So their behavior is affected by those who they have a direct tie to, okay? But you can also see that they're located in very different places within the network, right? C is in the middle, D is on the periphery, and this also has an impact, right, on people's behavior and what kind of information or resources they can access, right? So that's when we say our behavior is affected by those who we have ties to, but also where we're located in the network. Those two things impact people's behavior, okay? When Christakis talks about this, he says, okay, now imagine Imagine if there's a juicy rumor going through the network, you'd rather be C rather than D, right? Well, at least most people would, right? But if there's a deadly virus going through the network, you'd probably rather be D than C. Okay? Social network analysis, it differs from standard statistical approaches, right? Standard approaches tend to focus on actors' attributes. If we're talking about people, this can be like gender, race, education. If you're talking about nation states, it can be GDP, size, number of people, the size of the continent, that sort of thing, right? Square mileage. But attributes don't change from one social context to another, so we can't use them to explain how people's behavior changes from one context to another, right? So for example, this is from a book, Intro to Social Network Analysis book, and it compares a woman who at work shows very, very little initiative, right? But when she's with her neighborhood association or the local PTA, she's this dynamic leader, she's very assertive. Her behavior has changed, right? But her attributes haven't, okay? And that's what social network analysis tries to do, right? It's one way of capturing social context, right? It's not the only way, but it's a pretty good way, right? And that's why social network analysts will argue that interaction patterns are probably better for predicting and understanding people's behavior than our attributes, right? In fact, some social network analysts will push this to an extreme and say that attributes don't matter at all, right? There's no such thing as free will, everything's a black box, it's just our interaction patterns, that sort of thing. So, yeah, that's not where I am, but some people will push it to that extent. We use a lot of metrics, a lot of algorithms. We have our own sort of language, unique. I'm going to talk about a few of them here, just sort of give you a sense of, as part of this introduction. Like I said earlier, right, we talk about actors, right, instead of people, because even though social network analysis can be about people, it doesn't have to be about people, right? It can be about groups, it can be organizations, it can be tribes, it can be nations. When I first started working on social network analysis, some folks did this really nice thesis on some tribes in the Sudan, and they had an ethnographic section. It was a three-person team thesis. They had an ethnographic section, they had a game theory section, and they had a social network section. And in their analysis, their social network analysis section, the unit of analysis was the tribe, not the people, right? So we can do multiple levels. We talk about ties, right? Sometimes you'll hear them referred to as relations or links. Most of the time, though, we'll use the term ties, or you'll sometimes hear edges and arcs. Edges are basically reciprocal ties. So like when we're talking about spouses or kin or friends, those ties are reciprocal. But when we're using the term arcs, we're talking about ties with directionality, right? I send someone money, or I send someone an email, or I call someone on the phone, or I send someone bomb materials, or they send me bomb materials, right? That would be a tie with directionality to it. And then when you bring it all together, right, a social network is basically a pattern of actors and ties. And so this is an illustrative network. For actors, we'll often use, ellipses or squares or diamonds or triangles, that sort of thing. And then we'll indicate ties by either solid lines or dotted lines. Sometimes they'll have arrows on them. Sometimes solid lines will indicate positive ties and dashed lines will indicate negative ties, or sometimes solid lines will indicate strong ties, by which we mean close friends, that sort of thing. And dashed lines will indicate weak ties, people who are just acquaintances, that sort of thing. So when you see a graph, you have to sort of read the text to understand what the different symbols mean. But I think most of the time they look something like this, right? One of the things that's most important in our analysis is this notion of the overall topography of a network, right? Networks can vary in how big they are, how dense they are, how centralized they are. And these, at least I think, are very important factors that you need to take into consideration before you start crafting strategies to disrupt them. And I'll come back to that later. So here's an example of density, right? So the graph on the left is pretty sparse, and the one on the right is fairly dense, okay? Or at least the one on the right is denser than the one on the left. Centrality. We talk about centrality a lot within social network analysis, right? Here's probably the four most common ones. Degree centrality, which is a count of an actor's tie. Closeness centrality is just basically how close everyone is in terms of, in relationship to all other actors. If I had more time, I'd go into my whole 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon spiel right now, but I don't have time for that. But they basically, if you go to the Oracle of Kevin Bacon, you can type in an actor's name and they'll tell you how far they are from Kevin Bacon, right? That's a measure of closeness centrality. They're using a closeness centrality algorithm when they're doing that. Betweenness centrality. This is sort of like a brokerage measure, right? It sort of captures, it's not interested in how many ties someone has, right? It's interested in whether you lie between other actors within the network, because that puts you, well, between them, but also sort of captures your brokerage potential in the sense you're able to control the flow of material and non-material goods through the network. And then eigenvector centrality. This is similar to degree centrality, but it weights your centrality by whether you're connected to well-connected people or poorly connected people, right? So someone who scores high in eigenvector centrality is a well-connected person connected to well-connected people, right? This is essentially the same algorithm that Google uses to rank their web pages, right? So I don't know if some of you may remember before Google, BG, right? When you'd search for a web page, back then, I guess it was all we knew, but they weren't very good. You'd search on some term and you return these web pages and you go, okay, well, that's kind of close. And you'd scroll through all these things trying to find something. And then Google comes along and all of a sudden they're just so much better, right? So what they figured out, their variation of eigenvector centrality is called PageRank, named after Larry Page. But they figured out their web crawler just didn't go out and look for web pages with lots of links. It looked for web pages with lots of links to other web pages that had lots of links. And that's what it would return to you. It's very similar to eigenvector centrality. Now, like I said, these are the four most common centrality measures, but there's hundreds of them. There's even a periodic table of centrality measures, right? And this is an interactive one. I don't know if they've updated it recently, but you can click on it, hover over it, and then click on it. It'll take you to the original paper about it. It's a pretty nice little thing. So we use centrality measures to analyze networks, visualize networks. So here's sort of a random network, right? And here I've varied the sizes of nodes in terms of degree centrality. Here's in terms of closeness. Notice there's not a whole lot of variation in closeness. It's because it's a fairly well-connected network. Here's betweenness, right? So you can see some definitely score a lot higher in terms of betweenness here. And then there's eigenvector. And you can see it's a little bit weighted over there to the right, right? All right. We're also interested in identifying subclusters within a network. Mike doesn't like subclusters. Cohesive subgroups, right? We're looking for a level of clustering within these networks that can't be explained just by randomness, right? Because even in random networks, you're going to have some level of clustering, right? When you're looking at cohesive subgroups, you can see, is there a level of clustering that's greater than what you would expect in a random network of the same size and density, okay? And so we have lots of algorithms out there, but I'll just illustrate one here. So here's our same network, and we can turn these algorithms in and identify people who, based on the pattern types, who belongs to what subcluster. Sometimes it's hard to pick them out, so you can draw these little convex holes, they call them, around them. And I like these because, one, it sort of helps you identify the different groups visually, but it also shows how these groups kind of overlap with one another, right? And it's sometimes when they do these clustering algorithms, they have to assign an actor to one cluster or another, right? But some of them are really difficult to assign, right? And so this overlapping sort of captures some of that dynamic, right? So like if you look in that lower right, where you got mainly like red nodes, but there's like two blue nodes, right? A light blue node and a dark blue node. I suspect other algorithms might pop them into that subgroup. We're interested in identifying people who are brokers or ties that are bridges within the network, right? So back to this graph here, let's see. So if you see that lower cluster down there, there's a node number 15. It's really small, but and then you sort of see 3 nodes that are sort of on the edge of the other subgroup. They would be in positions of brokerage, right? If you ran a brokerage algorithm, say between us or something, 15 would probably be bigger, right, than those other 3 up there because he is the sole broker to that subgroup in the lower left. And then the ties between them you could see as being identified as bridges, okay? This one's easy to see, right? You can do that one by hand. But when you have a network that looks like this, it's a lot harder to identify brokers and bridges. And so we have algorithms that can do that for us, right? So I ran one recently, and so I tried to identify 15 brokers, and there's the ones that I identified. And then I used another algorithm called edge betweenness to identify potential bridges between brokers, okay? So there's different ways that we can analyze these networks. And as I mentioned at the beginning, some social network analysts don't use attributes at all, but most of us do, right? So even though we're trying to take all this relational data into account of the networks, we still often go back to how we also include in our analyses race, gender, education, age, GDP, size, and so on. All right, so how can we all use this to disrupt dark networks or illicit networks, right? So a few years back, one of my colleagues, Nancy Roberts, and I wrote a paper on strategies for countering dark networks. We actually wrote a follow-up on it too a few years later. And we identified a number of strategies. One of our concerns was that people seem to think that to use social network analysis to disrupt dark networks or illicit networks, you basically just ran centrality measures, ran a whack-a-mole operation, and you were done, right? And we were interested in countering that perception. And so we divided the strategies into kinetic and non-kinetic, or what we might call coercive and non-coercive. And like I said, there are some operations that are available in war zones that aren't in just regular criminal operations, right? And so under coercive, you have targeting, which can be capture-kill operations, you know. And then under non-coercive, right, you have things where like tracking and monitoring, institution building, PSYOP operations, information operations, rehabilitation types of programs. All of these are available, and we can use social network analysis to craft those, right? One of my favorites, well, I don't know if it's one of my favorites, but the tracking and monitoring. We actually didn't talk about that in our original article, but the former chair of our department, a guy named John Arquilla, he would say that when we first encounter a dark network, sometimes the best thing to do is nothing. He didn't really mean nothing, but what he meant was that we just shouldn't go out and just start whacking at it, right? The best thing we can do is we can track it, gather more information, right, and build our knowledge and information about the network itself before we start crafting any other type of strategy, right? That example I gave back at the beginning, we're feeding misinformation into the network. That'd be an example of the PSYOPs, right? And then rehabilitation strategies would be like, say, maybe peeling people off of the perimeter of the network and getting them to turn or flip and provide different types of information. So lots of different strategies out there. And these can be targeted at different levels. We can go after individuals, but we can also focus on groups, right? We can focus on organizations. So different levels of strategic strategies, right? And then we can use we encourage to use all different types of algorithms and metrics to craft these strategies, right? So we want to take into account topography or clustering and centrality, right? Not just centrality, and brokerage, right? And there's stochastic models that we can use as well. You know, formal statistical modeling where we can get measures of statistical significance. Let's see, I was going to say something about that, but I'm old now, so I forget things. So, yeah. Anyway, focusing on topography, right? So I talked earlier about how networks can vary between dense and sparse and be centralized and decentralized. Like I said, this is, I think, one of the, when we come to crafting strategy, I think this is like the first step that we should be doing, right? So consider for like centralization and decentralization. We know that really centralized networks are really good at command and control, but they're vulnerable to the removal of one or two individuals, right? Because they're so centered around these individuals. You remove them from the network can fall apart. I believe it was a Shining Path in Peru. It was really, really centralized. And they were able to arrest the leader and throw him in jail, and basically the network just collapsed after he was arrested. Okay? So networks, I mean, if for a dark network and illicit network to be effective, they don't want to be too centralized, but they don't want to go to the other extreme either and be really decentralized, because even though they're invulnerable to the removal of single individuals, if you get too decentralized, it's hard to mobilize people and resources, right? And, well, when I get to density, they're also easier to infiltrate, but I'll save that one for a second, right? So to be a successful illicit network, right, or dark network, you want to be somewhere in between the two extremes, right? Where that optimal level is will also be a function of how hostile or friendly the environment is where someone is operating, right? So like anecdotal evidence suggests that Al-Qaeda, prior to 9/11, was fairly centralized, right? They were living in Afghanistan, and even though they didn't get along great with the Taliban tolerated them, and so they could be kind of centralized. After 9/11, and when we invaded, then the environment became much more hostile, obviously, and anecdotal evidence suggests that Al-Qaeda became much more decentralized after that, right? By contrast, you can sort of think like the Provisional Irish Republican Army, when they were operating in Northern Ireland, a lot of times they could be fairly open about, their affiliation, right? Because it wasn't quite as hostile. And then get to Southern Ireland, or just Ireland, things changed. So if you can imagine this little graph here, it's not always right there in the middle, right? This is just illustrative, but the optimal point is somewhere in between those two poles. I have this, my sense is for a successful dark network, they're probably going to be a little bit on the decentralized side, right? But again, how much will vary on the environment in which it's in. Same thing when it comes to dense and sparse networks, right? Really dense, self-enclosed networks, they offer a lot of security. They're hard to infiltrate. It's hard to get subversive ideas are hard to work their way into the network. But because they're so self-enclosed, so dense, it's really hard they have difficulty accessing resources outside of the network, right? And so that can limit some of their capabilities. Sparse networks are just the opposite, right? They do have a lot of outside ties, but they're much easier to infiltrate, right? And so they're more likely to not just be infiltrated by other people, but by subversive ideas that could lead people to defect. One of our students a few years ago did an analysis of the Toronto 18, which was a terrorist group that was trying to carry out terrorist attacks in Canada that never really got off the ground. They were infiltrated and that sort of thing. I think this might be an example of what happened with them. So again, right, here you want to have the optimal level will lie somewhere in between the poles, and where that ideal point will be a function of the environment. And here my sense is that successful dark networks or illicit networks will be somewhat on the dense side, but again, there will be variation, right? You need some internal security. All right, so then if we combine all these things together, we can get a graph that sort of looks like this, where density on one dimension, centralization on another, and resilience or effectiveness on the vertical dimension. And so when you think about this, right, the most effective place for a dark network would be right there in the middle, right? So when we're crafting our strategies, right, what we should be doing is coming up with strategies that push these illicit networks, these dark networks, to the tails, right? We don't want to craft strategies that are going to push them back to the middle and make them more effective. We want to make them less effective, right? So that's why I argue that the first thing that we need to do is when we look at these networks is that we need to look at their overall structure, right, before we start jumping into other types of analysis. In fact, that's why in my book, both of them, the first chapter on the metrics, right, is topography in that one and also in that one. The other thing when it comes to social networks is that there's this bias towards centrality. I mentioned that Nancy and I, that's one of the motivations for writing the first article was that there was this, people just want to run whack-a-mole operations on key actors within a network. We did write a follow-up on that, and again, we sort of addressed this. And here the point was is that not only do we just not want to run whack-a-mole operations, but we don't want to lose sight of those groups that are on the perimeter of a network, right? So take this network, for example. This is resistant groups operating in Syria in 2011, 2012. And we wrote an article, the Core Lab wrote an article on these groups, and the initial article kind of focused on these clusters there in the middle, right? Notice how one of the things we found that when we were actually researching this article, not only there's a centrality bias, but just visually we tend to focus towards the center, right? And drawing circles even makes it worse, right? But what's interesting about this network is that down in the lower portion here is these other groups right here we didn't really pay a whole lot of attention to. It was these groups that helped ISIS get founded in Syria, right? They sort of split off from this and helped found ISIS in Syria. We didn't even pay attention to them at first, right? So when we're looking at these strategies, when we're trying to craft strategies, we want to pay attention to the whole network and not lose sight of those on the periphery. Other things about people on the periphery or networks actors on the periphery is that they're more likely to defect, right? So these guys defected, but they just didn't defect to us, right? They defected to ISIS. But if we're trying to run like rehabilitation or infiltration operations, often those folks in the periphery are easier to pick off than the ones in the center. A few caveats about using social network analysis when it comes to crafting strategies. One is prediction is really, really difficult, right? We like to think in terms of 100%. I don't know if you guys saw the movie Zero Dark 30, right? Yeah. Was it Leon Panetta or Obama? They wanted that 100% sure that Obama was going to be there. And I think in the movie, they said, yes, 100% sure, or something like that. Well, in real life, that's not what happened. I think the best that Panetta could give Obama was like around a 60 or 70% probability that Osama would be in that compound, right? We got to work with that, right? But we have a hard time thinking in terms of probabilities, right? So, I mean, like on our phones, right? If I called up the weather app, it would give me a probability of rain today, right? But I think we have a tendency just to look at that in terms of either yes or no, right? If I see 30%, I think no. If I see 70%, I think yes. But that's not really what the phone is saying, right? When it says 70%, it may not rain. And when it says 30%, it may rain, right? So when it comes to crafting these strategies, we have to take into account that we'll never know for sure, right? Which is why we often want to have more than one strategy, right? Just in case one doesn't work, right? We need fallback ones. So prediction is difficult, right? Another issue is that data on dark networks is hard to come by, which means our data may be incomplete, right? And so, as we point out in that original article, right, we want to use social network analysis for decision making. We want it to be an informative process, right? It's not a substitute for other types of information, right? They should inform decisions, right, but it shouldn't determine them, right? It's for the crafting of strategies, not the determination of strategies. I remember when I first started working at MPS, I was asked to go to visit the Jaedo facility up in Washington, D.C. to evaluate their social network capabilities, and there was basically it was just one person. this one woman who was just absolutely brilliant. And she told me about this story where she had taken some data and looked at different cities within Iraq and different type of analysis. She identified a city that looked like it had to be this hub of materials for IEDs that people were using for IEDs, but it hadn't shown up on anybody's radar. And she's going, well, I'm not sure about this, right? So she basically took her analysis and she shopped it to different sections within JIATO, right? And they sort of put their intelligence assets to it. And sure enough, they started looking for it. They found some information that confirmed what she had, right? And so then that led to the crafting of strategies that sort of focused on this particular city, right? But notice the difference there. She just didn't do her analysis and they went after and whacked this city, right? She did her analysis, then she gave it to different departments to confirm this actually might make sense before they went out and crafted some sort of strategy, right? So social network analysis can inform, but it should not determine, right? All right, so let's wrap up here. Social network analysis, right? We prioritize relations. We prioritize ties, right, over attributes when it comes to explaining and understanding behavior, right? Fairly straightforward. It's grounded in systematic and empirical data, right, which is why it makes capturing social context so valuable. We used to, I mean, we still do to a certain extent, record our data in matrices. I think matrices are very, very intuitive, right? So if you look at this thing here, right, we have ones and zeros. One indicates a tie between two people, right? So let's say this is a group of individuals, right? And if you look at that first row, I1 there's a 1 with 3W at the top, so that those two people have a tie, right? So fairly straightforward. I think matrices are really, really intuitive. And in a lot of the early social network analysis, that's all we used, right? But you notice there's a lot of zeros there. Matrices take up a lot of room, and so when you have really, really big networks, you know, like Twitter networks with thousands and thousands of nodes, hundreds of thousands of nodes, recording them as a matrix is almost impossible, right? I mean, you can, but then you can't do anything with it because the data set is so big because you have so many zeros. And so there's other more efficient ways of recording data. But still, I like to show the matrix because I think it's relatively intuitive and sort of illustrates the empirical grounding of this. We use a lot of visual imagery. So this is the network I promised earlier. This is a Norton Top Terrace network operated in Indonesia from 2002 to 2009. And this is like 10 different types of ties. I can't remember what, friendship, kinship, that sort of thing. And this would be really hard to draw by hand, right? But we have our algorithms, which can do it for us, right? And so you can see there's some clustering going on. When we talk about, and we use visualizations like this, right? We often talk about terms of social proximity and social distance, right? Actors can be socially proximate with one another. They can be socially distant from one another, right? So if you look at the ones in the upper right and the one on the far left, those two nodes would be considered to be socially distant from one another, whereas some of those ones like right in the middle, where they're lying right next to each other, right, they'd be socially proximate with one another, right? You can think of it sort of analogous to geospatial maps, right? You know, people can be geospatially close, they can be geospatially far from one another, right? Same thing here, but here we're talking about social distance rather than geospatial. But those visualizations, especially, but the algorithms too, they're very computer intensive, which is why social network analysis has really taken off in the last 20 or 30 years with the advent of the personal computer. A lot of that stuff that Harrison White was doing back in the 60s, I think they were running on, you know, mainframes. And even then they couldn't do a really, really, you know, what they could do then is just doesn't even compare what I can do on my little Mac back there, right? So when it comes to using social network analysis to disrupt illicit networks, like I said just a little bit ago, right? It should inform the crafting of strategies, but it shouldn't determine them, right? However, when we're doing this, we want to consider multiple strategies, right? Not just one. Let's think beyond centrality, right? And use all metrics and algorithms, right? In particular, like topography and clustering. I didn't give an example of clustering earlier. This is what I think the idea I had a while back that I forgot about. But I did have some students that looked at this one network where they applied some clustering to it. And they basically came up with a strategy, right? So they found two different groups, in this clustering algorithm. They said, okay, so, I mean, this is for class, right? But the guy who did this actually did this after he was graduated and actually did this successfully. But in a class, they had these two clusters. And they said, okay, we're going to arrest this guy, right? And then we'll hold him in jail for 2 or 3 days. And then we're going to release him. Then we're going to put a bunch of money in his bank account, right? And then we're going to arrest this guy over in this group, hold him for 2 or 3 days. And then we're going to release him, put a bunch of money in his bank account. And we're going to make this group think that this guy is sold out, and make this group think that this guy is sold out. And then they'll start fighting with one another, and the thing will implode, right? Pretty clever little strategy. And he came back and visited one day, and he said they actually employed that in one of their campaigns. He couldn't give me the details because it was classified, but it sounded pretty interesting. So that's basically what I got for you. If you guys got any questions, I'll do my best to answer them or fake my way through them. So.
So I'm curious about the qualitative aspect of the ties. So let's say I'm a terrorist and I get a lot of Amazon deliveries. So I meet my Amazon delivery guy almost every day. So there's lots of ties, quantitatively with the Amazon delivery guy. But I meet my terrorist co-confederate once every 6 months. But when we meet, we're planning an actual terrorist attack. How do you account for the difference in qualitative ties?
Yeah, so you always want to be, one of the most important things that we talk about, Mike wants to answer. Don't shoot the pizza guy.
Don't kill the pizza guy.
Yeah, I wanted to get a banner in the core lab that said, don't shoot the pizza guy. So maybe Amazon delivery, we can update it from the pizza guy, right? But no, so one of the things we talk about in class is probably the most difficult thing is drawing the borders on the network, who's in and who's out, right? And not only who's in and who's out, but what kind of ties matter too, right? So if you're, if you have networks, say the Northern Top network, we had enough data to sort of map their trust network, right? But we also had enough data to map their operational network. And there was a little bit of overlap between the two, but it wasn't 100%. It wasn't even close to 100%. But if you wanted to disrupt the trust network, you'd probably adopt very different types of strategies than, saying, going after the operational network. So going back to your question is that drawing the borders on the network is really, really important because you really don't want to kill the Amazon guy. And then focusing on the type of ties that sort of constitute will also inform your strategies too.
Thank you for the great talk. It was very illuminating. I would like to know more about what data sources you use to measure relational ties.
What kind of resources?
What data?
Sources to measure relational ties. So like a project building?
Could you give some examples on what kind of data are used to measure relational ties?
Well, like formal, like the matrix stuff I was talking about, or just?
No,
talk about the Northern Top. Where do we get that data from?
Oh yeah, so for Northern Top, it was sort of started off as a class project, and so they were using reports on the Northern Top network to craft to code the data, and they had to decide what types of networks ties they were going to code, whether it's going to be friendship, kinship, occupational, that sort of thing. Over time, I think we used the Northern Top, this one report on Northern Top for several years, and so we ended up with like 20 or 30 different types of network ties on the Northern Top network. What's interesting though is the first article on Northern Top that we used, or the primary one, had an appendix at the back that included 79 people, and so the initial coding just focused on the 79 people, but in the report itself, there was actually mentioned 137 people. And so eventually I had the students say, we need to expand this out to 137. So we expanded it out to 137. And then there was a follow-up report that bumped it up to like 230 or 237 or something like that. And so we actually expanded the Norton network out to 238 people, which we were doing some of our fine analyses. But then I got tired of looking at Norton, and I didn't. But then like the example I gave at the beginning by David Costa was looking at an insurgency. There, the data was more live, right? It was less historical. And so there he was looking at intelligence reports to gather his data there.
I got a couple. So I'll jump in here.
And you've done some criminal
my
ones,
focus over my time at MPS was with criminal justice, so law enforcement organizations. So what we would typically do is what you just saw is day one of the course that we were offering. And then for law enforcement, it's their records management data. So we would want to know things like who was arrested together, who was listed as an apartment together, we did a project with Houston Police Department looking at two gangs that were operating in an apartment complex, and they were engaging in carjacking, car theft. So based on it worked out that the time that we were with them, and we were embedded for about a year, coming back and forth, they had a number of search and arrest warrants written. So they took their affidavits, and kind of what Sean was talking about is we had to go through, read it. Well, they did this work, and they connected people to location, people to apartment, people to gang, arrested together, family ties. So that was the source of all that. And what was interesting, the outcome is that of all of the arrest warrants and search warrants, they actually missed the two shot callers. Because what they discovered was the people who are generally shot callers are not getting arrested or contacted by law enforcement. If we talked about density and sparse, how spread out networks are, if the two of us were the leaders, we were working through other people. They were able to figure that out because of the type of data that they had. So the source data depends on what information you're able to get. But in law enforcement, it's out there. In human trafficking networks, you're going to see things like where a police report might not be written. However, there's a field contact card. That could be another thing. Who was identified? Surveillance. A lot harder to capture because they're maybe calling it out and it's written down somewhere. But does that help to answer that question?
Yeah, one of the coolest data sets I saw, I mean, I haven't got access to it, was it was a co-offending network, in Chicago, that a guy named Papa Christos, who's done a lot of work on looking at gangs in Chicago and Boston, he mapped the co-offending network in Chicago from 2006 to 2014, and they were one of the things and so it's this huge network, and they were interested in the diffusion of gunshot injuries through the network, and so what turned out is that if you knew someone who had suffered a gunshot injury, well, then you were more likely to suffer a gunshot injury. That's intuitive, right? You're hanging around with people who are getting shot at, you're probably going to get shot at. But what they also found out was that you may not know someone who had a gunshot, if you're in this network, right? So it's still a co-offending network, but you may not know someone who's just suffered a gunshot injury, and they may not know someone that's had a gunshot injury, but someone 3 steps away could have suffered a gunshot injury. That still increased the likelihood that that person would also suffer a gunshot injury. That wasn't the only thing they looked at, but it was really interesting study.
We worked with, along those lines, we worked with Nashville Police Department. They had 4 juveniles escape from a facility, and they used SNA to look at what was the likelihood that those 4 people knew each other. And what Sean just talked about is when they were able to figure out that 2 of those escapees were 2 connections away from each other, and they were arrested together. So it was kind of an interesting result, is that but that helped them identify who to go talk to, that those people might have in common to identify where they were. Is there other questions? It's got to be more than 2. You got to ask 5, otherwise you can't leave. That's kind of like where we are. So 3 more questions. Someone has to have a question.
Oh, Nate.
Of course. On the other side. Yes, you do, because they got to hear you.
Okay, so I was hoping that you could write my lit review for me. No, I'm just kidding. But could you identify new trends in the literature that you think are really interesting, or the direction things are going in terms of social network analysis?
So last week I was in Switzerland. I mean, it sounds like this world traveler. That's actually the first time I've traveled out of the country since before the pandemic. But I was at a workshop for a group that's looking at jihadi networks in Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. Or is it Australia? Austria. That makes sense. So they asked me to present on social network methods, do's and don'ts. So I can give you the brief afterwards. So there are a lot of trends. There's a lot more what's called stochastic modeling, where you're actually using statistical models that provide you statistical significance to see whether or not, like, for instance, like I applied it to the evolution of the Hamburg cell in the lead up to 9/11 to see if I could statistically show that it was becoming more dense, more closed, more insular over time. And I was able to show that. And so that's one trend, right? So you have some things that are some stochastic modeling. Something that I'm finding really interesting, which I use in combination with social network analysis, is this thing called topic modeling, where you use these, basically it's a type of machine learning, it's a type of computational text mining, where you can just go through hundreds and hundreds of documents, right? And it can be anything from, I mean, a friend of mine, a guy named Dan Cunningham, who Mike knows, he and I analyzed the content of tweets related to the QAnon controversy. QAnon conspiracy theory, right? We pulled a bunch of tweets from 2020, like from April up to the election, or just the week after the election. I wish we would have kept going, but that's another story. So we got all these tweets, and then we pulled the content of them. We did a topic modeling of it, right? And you can sort of, with the computer, right, you can pull out, rather than having your own biases going when you're reading this, right, it'll go through an unsupervised and basically pull out the different topics that it's sort of, that emerges from the document. And I think we're finding between 16 and 8 different topics within the QAnon thing. Right now I'm working on one looking at biographies, short biographies of people who joined the Nazi Party prior to the Nazis becoming in power. So these are like the true believers, right? So there was a guy who ran a contest. He was a sociologist at Columbia University, and he hit upon this idea of running a contest where people could win money. They had to be members of the Nazi Party, and they had to be members of the Nazi Party before 1933, and they'd submit a biography on why they became a Nazi. And then he wrote a book, reading through all these things. They're all in German. Anyways, I found digital copies of these biographies, and so I've been running this topic modeling on these biographies. And so when you run topic modeling, you end up with what in social network analysis, what we call a two-mode network. You have topics by words. Words can be in more than one topic, right? And basically, it's this little matrix, not a little matrix, but topics, words, right? And so then I was able to use some of these clustering algorithms to see how the topics sort of clustered into different themes. Right? I'm still in the middle of it, so I haven't finished. I don't have any conclusions yet. And since I don't speak German very well, I do have a co-author who does. Because even though I don't need to speak German in order to run the models, I do need to know how to speak German in order to interpret the results, right? But again, you can you can use these clustering algorithms, divide them into different themes, which is really, really interesting. But then you can also use centrality algorithms to see which topics are more central to this discussion, to the conversation, which ones are more peripheral. So that's one of the things I'm finding fascinating, right? And so I do a lot of studies of historical dark networks just because the data are out there. The Nazi Party, prior to coming in power, is something of at least a gray network, and so hopefully we can learn something from that too.
2 questions left before we can leave. You already had one. Okay, wait. I'll come back.
How do you account for transliteration of names? Like Muammar Gaddafi had 32, 35,
Yeah.
and you're going through all the data. How how do you figure out that one person is, and the spellings and language, I guess the different language interpretations?
Yeah, that's really, really difficult. You basically have to set up your computer program to just run through, and you sort of have to be aware of all the different spellings, and then just sort of combine them all into a single thing. There's a guy in our department who is just doing this amazing stuff with Twitter data, right? Because in Twitter data, well, now that Elon's got a control of it, it's harder to get a hold of. But we used to be able to do a lot of analysis of Twitter data. But he sort of shut that pipeline off. But anyway, when you sign up for Twitter, you can say where you're from, right? So I put in San Jose. But if I'm in Germany and I'm tweeting, it still says I'm tweeting from San Jose, right? So it's often hard to get geospatial location on this. And what this guy has figured out is a way to not only take that information, but also how they're talking. And so he runs into issues about the same word being spelled different ways, and also the same word being used in different contexts. And he is able to these really complicated algorithms to get like 95% accuracy on where these tweets are coming from. And it's just amazing. And he's used this in order to predict. He's able to show that he can do a pretty good job of predicting the outcome of violence. So he's got this historical data from like 2014 and 2015. He just bought the whole Twitter hose. And he was able to show that using certain algorithms, he could predict violence breaking out within a week afterwards. It's just pretty amazing. And he just got money to look at, to use different types of social media type of data, apply these same algorithms to seeing the influence of, see how influential China actually is with its One Belt, One Road initiative. Because there's a lot of assumptions that, it's exerting all this powerful influence. And he's going to look at it on sort of at the ground level to see if, in fact, this is really, really true. But one of the biggest issues is what you talked to is all these multiple spellings of things. And
Who's that?
Actually, so.
A student needs to ask the last question, not a staff. And don't put, I can see Jones is influencing people here with this.
Okay, so my question would be, so I'm kind of curious when you're looking at people like back then who were writing it like by hand, okay, compared to now you have all these good technologies and things. Is there an example of a time that maybe they used that handwritten one? Because obviously there was differences in like the connectedness of them, like obviously there was discrepancies in them. Is there like an example or been a time when like that's had like a serious effect? Like it's actually been a problem, like compared to using like an actual like computer system or like handwriting it?
So I didn't actually digitize those ones, but I don't know how to do that actually. But I think the people who digitized those biographies, those Nazi biographies, struggled with that because the originals are, I don't know how the Hoover Institute ended up with them at Stanford, but the Hoover Institute has all the handwritten ones there. And these guys came in and used some machine readable stuff to do it. I assume that after they did that, they went back through and did a little spot check to make sure that it had been digitized. Okay, but I can't answer your question really well. That's not my area of expertise.
Stumped him. Good job.
Camber could probably answer it.
He would probably answer it and go back to the beginning of time to answer it.
But Camber's wicked smart.
Okay, last call. All right, Dr. Everton, thank you for being with us. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks.